The timing of this with the World Cup was perfect, but that's not how it was when we created it. I thought about when I work with people on helping them be good listeners, because that's the skill that leaders or anybody needs to be a good communicator. I started thinking, what are the skills that they need as far as listening is concerned? It's not just listening. As I mentioned earlier, it's observing and listening in order to engage. And when I was throwing that around in my head and we were thinking about it, I started thinking about, well, what type of acronym can help? I love ties and I love the 3 V's. What can I do for listening? And that's where we came up with OLE. Now, those of you who know sports know that that's often the cheer, and very often in soccer, especially soccer or football in other countries. And OLE means bravo. It's also used in bullfights. But it also means, when it's translated from the Spanish, is anybody here fluent in Spanish? No? Okay, yes? Do you know what OLE means in Spanish? How would you describe it? Wait 1 second. I want to just grab this one. See, I asked you spoke Spanish and you answered me, right? Give me 1 second here. Okay. Jennifer.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So, I guess.
I thought you were like psychic or something. Yeah, just OLE just means like go for it, or let's go, bravo kind of thing, or it's kind of like a cheer, like hooray and stuff like that. So it could literally be anything positive.
Right, and when I looked it up, Jennifer,
oh my God, I was doing that like thing with my voice.
You were doing vocal fry. Now you're starting to recognize things. Should we try it again, or I'll leave you alone? Okay. And OLE, when you look it up in Wikipedia, it says you're rising to the level of your highest level of excellence. And I thought, oh my goodness, what a great way to think about this. Because if you're a good listener and a good leader, you're rising to the top level of performance in what you do every day. And so think about, and the other thing is you think OLE, it does help you because this is a real earworm. Once you hear this, you're going to be singing it. Like my husband and I sing it all the time now whenever we hear it. But as you sing it, you remember it's observe, listen, engage. It's a great way to remember the good skills that you should have as a listener. Many of you may have seen this quote, and it's that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So when you think about it, shouldn't we be listening twice as much as we speak? But do we? Are we good listeners? What does listening mean to you? Like if you were going to think about listening, I'm hesitant at this hour to let you all start talking. I may never get you back again. But if we talk about listening, what are some things that listening means to you? If I say I'd like you to be, or you want to be a good listener, what does it take to be a good listener? Any thoughts?
Being engaged.
Being engaged, yes. Like OLE, being engaged. Anything? I heard something over here.
I said attention.
Attention, paying attention. How could you listen if you're not paying attention? Anything else on this side of the room? Any other comments on being a good listener? How do you show the people that you're working with, or you're sitting at a meeting, how do you show that you're a good listener? Any? Body language. Meaning what? Tell me a little bit about that.
Making sure that you're facing them when you're talking.
Oh.
Not like turning away.
Okay, so facing them, having good eye contact, not turning away. I love that, because if you go to networking meetings, how often are you at a meeting and you're talking to somebody and you're kind of talking to them like this? How engaged am I when I'm twisted around, facing the door where everybody else is coming in and trying to talk to somebody? They might as well walk away because I'm not that interested. So body language is a really good way to show you're listening. Anything else? Yes?
Oh,
I like what you said. Say that again, Adam?
It can make a related point to what they've already said.
So make a related point to show that you're listening, that it's connected. An interesting story is I once worked with somebody who was involved in matchmaking, but he was the recipient. His parents were trying to find a match for him. He was Orthodox, and that was what his family did. And he was being extremely unsuccessful with the matches when he'd go on the first date. And so they wanted to engage my services to help him. And when I said, what are some of the questions that you're asking? And he had a laundry list of questions. Like, do you like exercise? Do you like this? Do you like that? And he's going through a list. And what he didn't understand is you have to follow through with what the person says and respond to it. Conversation is like a tennis match. If you're not going back and forth with a conversation, that's not a conversation. And so following up, that's an excellent point. Anything else? Well, I will tell you a few more things. Let's take a look first at what listening can be.
It is crucial that you listen, Dwight. Also, you want to respect their... Are you listening now?
Yes.
Okay, well, you have to show us.
That's impossible. Listening happens in the ear and in the brain. I mean, some organisms have external hairs that vibrate to indicate auditory stimulation, but unfortunately, our external hairs don't vibrate at all.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
What are you doing?
A little smile and a nod shows that I hear you. Got it?
Kind of.
Nellie, why don't you tell Dwight what we were doing earlier today, and Dwight, you show us that you're listening.
Well, we were in the warehouse where we were discussing the mural that I've commissioned Pam to paint there. We were talking about the colour schemes and the major themes we want to hit. Children of the world coming together, cutting down trees to make paper, but not in a child labouring way.
It's just up and down. Just a regular nod, like a person.
I am a person.
Of course, you're a person. Yeah. We can do this, all right? And then we thought I can't carry on with that face. Look at it, I'm going to get nightmares with that face. I mean, he looks like he is labouring over a stool having just eaten human flesh.
It's a bit extreme.
No, I'm sorry, but that is true.
He's screwed. The meeting's in less than an hour.
Okay. A little bit of an exaggeration, but hopefully that will stick with you on maybe somebody who's following some of the rules for listening, but it's not really working. I'd like to go a little bit deeper in listening and talk about that. Whoops. Okay, how do we spend our day? Let me back up here 1 second here. What's really interesting, these statistics show that we spend our day with a little bit of writing, with more reading, with even more speaking, but 45% listening? Here's what I find amazing. When we went to school, grammar school, what did we learn? We learned reading, the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, right? Do we learn speaking? Now, some people have public speaking classes, but to the best of my knowledge, when I went to high school, I had a public speaking class. Most of the public schools now do not give public speaking. Some of the private schools still do or give you the opportunity to give a speech, but they're not really teaching speaking. How much are they teaching listening? I never learned, other than maybe exercises and the teacher reading something and you're having to respond, but nobody ever taught me how to listen. We're not really focusing on that as an important skill set, and yet it's critical, especially in the workplace. If we're not listening, what are we doing if we're all talking and not listening? I love this quote by Stephen Covey. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Let me just say that again. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand what you're saying. They listen with the intent to reply. And let's be honest here. How many of us do that? A lot of us do. right? We're at a meeting or a meeting with our manager or whatever it is, and our wheels are turning. What am I going to say next? What am I going to say next? Or I'm trying to be persuasive. Let me focus on what I have to say. And you're missing the communication. So many of us are guilty of this. This is a Chinese symbol for active listening. And it's perfect. I love it. I'm going to switch back to my other pointer. I have this new pointer that I'm going to talk about later, which could be wonderful, except it keeps stopping my videos. But with the active listening, we have the ears to hear, because Chinese symbols are a combination of different characters. One part is the ears to hear, listen. Another part is the eyes to see. So we have the observe, the listen. But then I think this is really interesting that these are at the bottom. We have, which is already mentioned before, undivided attention so that we focus. But this is what's so important. The mind to think and the heart to feel. Now, when I've done a lot of reading on listening skills, they don't talk that much about the mind and the heart. But if we don't bring that into it, we're not being a complete listener. There are different types of listening, and you have this in the handout, but I'd like to just talk about it because we get deeper and deeper and deeper, and some of us don't get to those deeper levels when we're communicating. There's the inactive listener, and that's when you just hear the words. I'm talking, you're checking your email, you're focusing on something else, you hear the words I'm saying, but you're really not that focused. And if somebody said, well, what did Linda talk about? You got some of it, but you really weren't that engaged to remember things. And then there's selective hearing, that all of a sudden, if I say something that sounds really relevant for you, your ears perk up and you start listening. Or you're listening to me, but you're not hearing other distractions in the other room because you are focused. But selective hearing isn't hearing everything, it's just hearing what you want to hear. The active listening that we just spoke about with Dwight, or we just watched with that, is listening to the complete message or showing somebody that you're listening to that complete message. So you're listening to the verbal and you're watching the nonverbal. And that sounds good, but that doesn't mean you're fully listening. He faked it. Well, it was pretty obvious how he was faking it. But that doesn't mean you're getting the whole message. It means that you're just listening and watching and picking up some of the nonverbal. But you can go deeper than that. And that's when you get to reflective listening. And so that's something, was it Adam? I forgot your name. Adam. Where you're responding to something somebody's saying. So they say something, but you want to make sure, you may stay on the same line of thought, or you want to make sure you're getting it right, so you try to clarify. Like what you were saying was, and then they could say, no, that's not what I meant. But it's engaging now, and it's being more of an active listener. It's asking questions. It's restating things, not just parroting it back, but restating it so that you are reflecting it and you're coming to a common understanding that what Colin is saying to me, I'm getting because I'm telling you back that that's what it is. You may clarify and say, Linda, that wasn't exactly it. Let me explain it better. And all of a sudden, we really understand what we're talking about. We're very much engaged in listening and speaking. But then we get to the deepest level. And that's the empathic listening, where you show empathy. And there's a resource that I'll talk about, but you can get into what this person described in the book, and I thought it was wonderful. You get in that person's movie. You have to get out of your perspective and jump into that other person's. So you're at work and somebody is saying, we have this big meeting coming up. I am sick about it. I am so nervous. I have to present about it. Well, if your response is, don't worry, you'll be fine, you're clearly not being an empathic listener. But if you respond by thinking, all right, I wouldn't be that nervous, but he's pretty nervous, acknowledging that and getting into his perspective, you're going to be communicating a lot better. And when I read this book, it helped me think about it more, that we very rarely become empathic listeners. We have to work at that. But we may not agree with what somebody's saying. Somebody once came up to me after I did a listening workshop, and she said, what do I do? I'm the graphic designer at this company, and I go to the meeting, and this marketing person is a jerk. And everything he says is ridiculous. And I go in the meeting, but I know I can't say it, and I don't know how to communicate with him. And the only thing I could say is, if you can get into his shoes, into his perspective, and accept the fact that he really thinks he knows what he's talking about. He's confident that he knows what he's talking about. I may not agree. It'll make me feel better about the interchange. Her problem was that she'd get red in the face and get all nervous, and she didn't know how to control it. And part of it is, get in that person's movie, and then you don't get as defensive. And so if that's one lesson I can teach you about listening skills, I know it's helped me a lot. When I don't agree with somebody, at least acknowledge they're really confident about that, and it's important to them. So let me listen to it from that perspective. And then there are some steps you can take to become an effective listener. Again, be ready and motivated. If you're sitting there with your phone or reading the newspaper, whether it's at work or with a companion or partner or husband or boyfriend, girlfriend, if you're sitting there with something else, you are not engaged. Even if you say, I'm listening, I can hear what you're saying, I can do two things at once. We really can't. And how does it make a person feel if you walk in to talk to them and they immediately put away their phone, put away whatever's on their desk, and look at you? That's really undivided attention. And that, remember, we talked this earlier today about body language. I'm sending such a signal of disinterest when I'm focused on something else. And so be ready and motivated to listen to that person. Listen to what they're saying. Interpret what their intention is. Try to understand that. Demonstrate some empathy, but avoid judgments. We all have our judgments. So there may be times you go to a meeting and you know that person never says or never speaks succinctly, and you know you don't agree with what he's going to say anyway, and you have all this judgment in your head that's really preventing you from listening. Try to suspend that. Also, your emotional filters. How often do we judge somebody just by seeing them and assuming we're not going to agree with what they say? That's preventing us from listening. And of course, you want to read the nonverbal communication. Again, think about that you're watching that person's story, and it's going to help you be a better communicator when you do that. What do you do to show you're a good listener? We had the question earlier, Laura, you asked about leaning forward. Leaning forward is a really good way to be engaged with somebody. What else can you do to show that you're really listening? Any other thoughts? Clarify the questions, right? Stop what you're doing. But the body language of having the eye contact and leaning towards somebody is going to show that you're much more engaged. What I'd like to do is I'd like to do something again with partners. I'd like you to find somebody at your table. I won't ask you to go anyplace else, and I'm not even asking you to video, because this is all about listening. Take a different partner, even if you're at the same table. Find somebody else to talk to. And what I'd like you to do, make it real simple. We're going to make it real simple. You can still use that tie strategy. But I'd like the first person, and again, whoever's birthday is first can go first, just to arbitrarily set that up. I'd like you, the first person, to talk about some plans for your summer vacation, whether you had it already or you're going to have it or you don't have any. Talk about that for a minute. But I want your partner to demonstrate poor listening skills. All right? Poor. So what does it mean by poor listening skills? What are some things that you would do? Not pay attention. What's that? Look away. Look away. There's another one, verbally. What's something I could do where I'm not a good listener? Interrupt. How often do we interrupt or finish somebody's thought? So take a moment with your partner to talk about your summer vacation and let your partner show really poor listening skills and see how it feels when you talk to somebody that way. And go ahead and do that. Okay, what were some of the things that you used to be a very poor listener? Yes, back there.
I just turned around. I was kind of thirsty, so I got some water.
Turned around, drinking water? Okay, so that you weren't as connected. What's the other?
Cell phone.
Looking at your cell phone. Yeah, I'm listening, but I'm looking at my cell phone. Anything else? I was drawing. Withdrawn? Oh, drawing, right? So doodling or drawing. Anything?
Fidgeting.
Fidgeting. Okay, like finish what you're saying. I really got to go someplace. Got to go to the bathroom or whatever it might be.
He was yawning a lot.
Yawning, okay. What's that? Getting up, okay. Right, I'm just getting a cup of coffee, but I'm really listening to you. How does that make the person feel? Anything else?
He started talking to somebody else.
He started talking to somebody else, like, oh, you're pretty boring. Okay, okay. Anything else? Yes?
He asked me a question that I clearly answered one sentence ago.
Ah, so repeating, so it's very obvious he wasn't listening. Okay, so just think how valued you feel when you're talking that way. All right, so let's try something, and now let's flip it. We're not going to talk about the same topic. Let's flip it, and I want the other person to talk about something about yourself that maybe they don't know. Either a hidden talent, a hidden interest, something they may not know about. And I want your partner to be very engaged in what you're talking about. All right, so let's try that. Turn it. Oh, those are a lot of cookies. Nice. Okay. What were some of the things that you did this time that showed that you were a good listener? Any comments? So you were not a good listener. All right. Okay. So what was interesting is Ron thought you were trying to be a good listener and you were really failing, right? What things do you do to be a really good listener? Yes. Nod your head. Yes, absolutely. Nod your head. What else?
Ask questions.
Ask questions. Good.
Using parallel examples.
Using parallel examples. Tell me a little more what you mean by that.
I was talking about how I like to puzzle, and he was talking about how someone else was puzzling.
Okay, so just be careful with that. That's good to go along with what the person's saying. That's very important, but be real careful about this. And let me give you an example. Your name is?
Lucas.
Lucas. Lucas, tell me, do you have any summer plans?
I just got back from a trip from Florida.
Oh, I just got back from a trip from Florida. I love going to Florida. It's a great place to go for vacation. Now, how good of a listener was I just now, right? So I'm doing something parallel. I'm taking something you said and I'm grabbing it, but I just took control of the whole conversation. So try it again. Where did you go on vacation?
St. Augustine.
Oh, tell me about it. What did you do down there?
Nothing much. It was 3 of our families all together, and we all just hung out on the beach and had a good time.
Have you been to St. Augustine before?
We try to go every year. So, yeah.
Why there?
A lot of our family is from up north, and they don't get down south very often, and they like to go and burn. So it's very fun.
Okay. Now, did you see the difference in how I just communicated? So many of us do this. When somebody starts talking, we can try to connect by hijacking the story and saying, oh, I know what you mean, I do that too. Or, you went to St. Augustine, I just went to Europe. Yeah. Well, what was the point of connecting with somebody that way, right? So be careful. You want to do some parallel, but just be careful you're not hijacking and taking control. You want to be able to listen. Yes?
So when someone does hijack a conversation, how do you bring it back to where you started without being rude? And
That's a great question. Well, you could say, if they come up for air. As you asked me, I went to St. Augustine. Let me tell you a little bit about it. I mean, that's not rude, right? But there will be people that are clueless, and it's all about them. And that's what we have to be careful about. If we want to be a good listener, it's not all about us. It's all about the person we're talking to. We want to get them to talk, but we don't want to hijack. Now, there are people who then monopolize, and it's like, oh, did you ever go out with people and you get home that night and you say, do you know, they don't know a thing about us? They talked about themselves the whole time. We don't like that either. So not everybody has the skill, but you want to at least exercise the skill of a good listener, and hopefully there is the back and forth, but that's a great question. Any other questions about the listening skills? So listening is important. Think about, you may start to recognize, believe me, I recognize it in myself, that sometimes I realize somebody says something and I just took over because I wanted to talk and I forgot it was really them that was talking. Because when it comes right down to it, most of us like to talk about ourselves. Some of us who are more shy may be just as happy to let the other person talk. So just know the good questions to ask. But eventually you should say something so that there's a balance in the conversation. Are there any other questions about listening skills? Questions or comments? Yes? So you would find it rude if we were talking in business and you completely changed the topic and I wanted to get back to it.
And went, as I was saying.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's a great point. Did I say as I was saying?
As you asked.
Okay, that may be different, but if you're saying something like, as I told you, as I was saying, as I said before, all of those are very hostile, those comments. But if I say, you know, you asked me about that and I never got a chance to answer, let me tell you what I'm thinking, it's all how you say it. It's your tone of voice and your choice of words. But if you send me an email and I send it back and say, as I told you, it will be ready on Friday. Well, maybe they didn't remember. Now all of a sudden I'm being very offensive the way I'm speaking to them. All right, so that's a great point that you made, but it's how you say it. So if you're trying to make a point at the meeting and everybody's jumping over you and they got past you, you might say, can I add something? Earlier you asked me what my recommendations are on the project. I'd like to finish what I was saying. And if you say it in a nice way, I don't think that's hostile. Do you? If it's said that way. But as I was saying, when you interrupted me, is of course totally different. So it is, a lot of it's the tone of voice and your word choice. Did you have a question back there?
It's about argumentative listening.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you get out of somebody who's kind of argumentatively listening to you?
And explain that a little bit more, Eric.
So it's kind of like when you're talking to me and personally about something, all I'm doing in my head is trying to argue with you. I know what I want to say, and it's going to be against you just to get away, just to argue with you because I'd like to argue.
Mm-hmm.
How do you kind of get around that? Like, how do you talk to someone who's trying, all they want to do with you is argue?
Well, you could walk away.
Yeah, walk away.
You could walk away. But you can even just say, obviously we don't agree with that. You're entitled to your opinion. Right? It's the same thing we'll talk later about the hostile person in the audience. They're out to get you. You can't engage. You're not going to win. Right? And if you start fighting with somebody, they're going to get annoyed. Everybody's going to get annoyed at you. But if it's like, you know what, Eric, you don't agree with what I'm saying, and I value your opinion, but why don't we just leave it at that? That's your opinion, and I think something else. And nobody in the audience is going to get annoyed at me for doing that either. But if I start being antagonistic, I may lose more people in that process. So that's a great question. Anything else? Okay, let's talk about public speaking. Who here has a little bit of anxiety about getting up to speak in front of 150 people? Okay, so everybody's being fairly honest here. Who here has a little bit of concern about speaking just to your team, getting up to your team on something that's real important, and people may know that you didn't do everything exactly right? There are a lot of situations. Public speaking anxiety is very normal. Early in my career, when I started having a lot of presentations at conferences, and I was in my late 20s, and I was very nervous doing it, I remember somebody who had spoken at conferences all around the world. He said to me, the day you wake up to give a presentation and you're not nervous, you better start to worry. And I thought, well, how interesting. And he was so good at what he did. But he said, you need the nervousness. You need the adrenaline. It's just all how you frame it. But if you say, I'm so nervous, I'm going to be sick, I can't do this, I'm telling myself all the negative. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but there's a lot we need to do to help us harness that nervousness or anxiety or whatever we choose to describe it. Now, they've talked about the 10 top fears. And some of the fears are dogs, loneliness, flying, death. Death is 7. Sickness is 6. Where do you think public speaking is going to come as I'm going up? Okay, some of you are saying 1. Here's number 2 is heights. And I can actually tell you this is a picture of a bridge I walked across a few weeks ago. And it's one of the longest suspension bridges in the world. And when you walk across it, it's narrow and it sways. And there are some people who just will not do it. Some people do it, but it was very, you look down and you see so many feet below you and water. It's fairly frightening. And I think so many fears are valid. But interestingly enough, public speaking has always been thought of as the top fear. Why do you think this is? Why do you think people are so nervous about public speaking? Any thoughts? Yes, back.
Because it's an opportunity to be judged.
It's an opportunity to be judged, especially by your peers, because they will know if you don't say something right. Right? Somebody over here?
I was what I was going to say.
Okay, to be judged. That's one of the toughest. It's easier sometimes to talk to a room full of strangers than the people who you know are going to judge you and know if you're not doing something right. Any other reasons? Look, it makes you very vulnerable. You're right out there. What if you fall? What if you trip? What if you do something, fall off a stage? I mean, there are a lot of things you can do. And so public speaking anxiety or fear is not abnormal. It makes sense why people feel this way. In fact, Jerry Seinfeld said, judging on that list, at a funeral, somebody would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. And the other interesting thing is 74% of people in the United States suffer from some form of public speaking anxiety. And that's according to the National Institute of Mental Health. If you have this fear, you are not alone. The question is, what do you do about it? And let me back up for a minute. I remember that when I went to school, and full disclosure, because people say, well, you do public speaking all the time. But I remember when I went to school, in high school, and had a public speaking class, I was sick to my stomach by having to give a speech. I mean, it's normal because then, especially when you're a teenager, you're worried about being judged, you're worried about making a mistake, you're worried about getting in front of the room and shaking and making a fool out of yourself because you're so focused on those things. There are some strategies I learned there that have been invaluable for me. And over the years, I picked up other strategies as I had more opportunities to be in stressful situations and as I worked more in my field. And so I've broken them into 3 areas. You're going to be nervous. That's part of it. Accept it. When you watch the Super Bowl or any sporting event and they're doing the national anthem and you're watching the speakers, the athletes, like even the football players, and they're doing the national anthem, you think they're relaxed? They're not relaxed. They have so much adrenaline running through their body, but they don't say, I'm nervous. They say, I'm ready. They say, I'm excited. And so a lot of it is how you frame it. So I like to look at 3 different ways to deal with this anxiety. One is what you do before. Certainly prepare, because if you don't prepare, you will be nervous, and you have every right to be nervous if you have no idea what you're going to be doing. And practice. Practice what you're doing, but don't practice to the point of memorizing. Please don't memorize. Why do I say that? If you memorize, you run the risk of losing track, and you don't know how to get back on track of your talk. You also don't want to write out your entire talk because you will then read it and it sounds like you're reading it. Now, there are certain situations, if you're speaking at a hearing, legal hearing, you may be reading information. But you need to make sure that it doesn't sound like you're reading when you're talking because people will be completely turned off. You're not being authentic. Another strategy, if you're very nervous, or just a good strategy when you're speaking to a group and you don't know the people, talk to them ahead of time. Because then you get in front of the room and maybe you've spoken to 15 people in the room already and you could connect with them. It makes it a lot easier. Or I'm working with a top manager at a large company and she said that she comes across so serious and she happens to be from Poland and her speaking style is very abrupt and everybody shudders and she never smiles, and she's the nicest woman, but she's just not coming across in a friendly way. And I said, when you get to that, and she's all keyed up at these meetings. I said, when you get to the meeting, who do you like the most in the room? And she told me the person. I said, start by talking to him. And if you talk to him, you'll be friendlier, and you'll be more pleasant, and you'll be less nervous, and then you start talking to other people. So there are strategies we can do beforehand. But then let's look at the cognitive part, what's going on in our brain, because that's really what messes us up. We want to have positive self-talk. Why did I ask Craig to talk at the meeting? Probably because Craig knows something about that topic, and you have to remind yourself that. You were not asked to speak to make a fool out of yourself. Nobody wants to see you fail. You were asked to speak because you know something about it, and keep telling yourself that. You need the positive self-talk. That I know what I'm talking about, I'm prepared, I may be nervous, but that's okay, I'll get through this. Visualize success. Think about how it's going to be very successful. Nobody has ever really, that I know of, died of giving a speech. You get to the other end of it, so think about the other end. All right, so if I were a nervous wreck about today, which I wasn't, but think about the happy hour. It's going to end, and then you're going to talk to people. There is something at the other side of that speech or of that meeting. So think about being successful with that. This is the most important thing I'm going to say. We usually get nervous because we think we're being judged, right? And we're going to make a fool out of ourselves. But in all reality, it's not about me. When I talk, it's about you. And if I start thinking about what does this group of people need to know, what information can I give them that's valuable, it's taking all the pressure off me because I'm focusing on what I want you to get out of the day. And that's a great way to take away some of the anxiety. But our brain does crazy things with us, and our body does crazy things. And we have a reflex, the fight, flight, or freeze reflex. And it's a reflex. It's physiological. So we will have the heart rate, and we will have the perspiring, and we will have the jitters, and that is all real, right? Because we think, the primitive brain thinks that some bear is coming to attack me, and I have to be ready to run away. And that's what I perceive as the speech, that I'm being completely threatened, and my body is taking over, and I'm so nervous. So what do we do about that? There are several different strategies. One is exercise. Exercise before you have a big speech or before a meeting. You get rid of some of that adrenaline, and just like the football players are maybe just moving around a little bit, they're getting rid of some of the adrenaline so that they can perform. So sometimes taking a walk or walking up a flight of steps before the meeting may calm you down a little bit more because you're focused on something else. Relaxation, if you know that, that's another helpful thing. Meditation. All of these things are going to help calm you down. And then sometimes it just doesn't work. And once years ago, again in my late 20s, I was at a conference, and it was at Juilliard Conservatory, if any of you know about that, in New York City, this big conference with ear, nose, and throat doctors, singing teachers, acting teachers, speech and language pathologists, singers, actors, and somebody in her 20s who shows up there, which was me. And I never liked public speaking. And on the break, I saw my professor and mentor who helped me and taught me how to work with voice and how to work with everything that I do now. And he was always a great, he had this wonderful voice, and he knew how to wing it. Like I always knew when he'd work with clients, he didn't really prepare a lot, but he just always nailed it. He had that charisma. And I didn't realize, I saw him during the coffee break, and I hadn't seen him in 5 years. And then I see he's the next speaker. And he goes up on the stage of this huge auditorium, and he stands up there, and he says, "It just so happens my former graduate student is here today, and I'd like her to come up on the stage." And I really thought I was going to die, right? My heart was pounding, and I'm sure everybody could see it pounding out of my body. I started perspiring. I had to climb over everybody in that row and walk up this aisle and walk up steps to get on a stage at Juilliard. And I hated public speaking, and I didn't know what I was going to do up there. I couldn't even breathe. And he had me sit in a chair, and I was so angry. But I had all these people watching me, and now my career is going to end because people are going to realize that I don't know what I'm doing because I'm so nervous. How could I work with other people if I can't do this? So I sat down. He had me sit in the chair, and I put my hand where I could feel my breathing. And my breathing was like this, because that's what your breathing's like when you're that nervous. And so I dug deep and said, okay, what do I teach my clients to do? And I teach them to do candle breaths, where you imagine you're flickering a candle. And so I take my breath, and I would go, and then I take another breath. And I took these easy breaths, not deep, fast breaths, because I would have passed out, but I took these easy candle breaths, and what did it do to my heart rate, do you think? It dropped my heart rate. It increased the oxygen to my brain, and I calmed down in front of all these people. And I said, you know, I was ready. I was so angry at him for doing this to me, and I realized it was the best gift he could have done because I know it works. You can actually control your nervousness by just breathing. Granted, you could do meditation before, relaxation before, but that doesn't always work. But just the breathing. So if you can walk away with one strategy, make sure you're breathing. If you're not breathing, you can't calm yourself down. Another thing is, in my public speaking class in high school, where I said I was so nervous and I couldn't concentrate in the class before because I knew I had a speech in 30 minutes, and I was a nervous wreck. And you get up to give your speech and you grab onto the podium and your legs are shaking and your hands are shaking and your voice is shaking, and when you're 17 years old, that could be the worst thing in the world. And my teacher taught us a strategy. And she said, pretend you're a tree. And you're a tree, and the tree has roots. So curl your toes down to the ground to reach into the ground, and all of your nervous energy is there. And it drains from the rest of your body. And you can't see right now that I'm curling my toes, but all my tension is there, and it relaxes you. So if you're in a meeting and you're nervous, curl those toes, just grab the ground with it. And people don't see it. Of course, if you're wearing sandals, they might. But people won't see it, but all that nervous energy goes away from you. And it's so much easier to talk. So those are some strategies you can use for public speaking to help you with this. Now, there is that situation where none of it works. What do you do then? And actually, I have a daughter who's a neuropsychologist and does not love public speaking, and had to give a webinar to thousands of people, plus like an audience full of people live. And she obviously was nervous, and she should be nervous, and that's okay to say you're nervous. That's your adrenaline. But if you say, I'm nervous and I have energy, rather than I'm scared I'm going to make a mistake, think of nervousness as I'm excited. I'm excited to present. I was at a meeting the other day, and somebody said, I'm so nervous because this is so important. Well, better she should say, I'm so excited because I care so much about what I'm going to explain to you right now. It's, again, how you frame it. So back to my daughter, she said to me, I did the breathing, I did this, I do meditation, I do exercise, I do this. I knew that I was still nervous, and she had reason to be nervous. And she said, so at that point, I just went for it and knew that eventually you get better. That nervousness is usually those first few seconds, and sometimes you just have to push right through it. And that's why you need to know how you're starting your talk. That's what you have to nail that, because you're most nervous at that point. So if you can then have that ready in your back pocket, and I know what I'm going to say, just move through it if none of these work. So hopefully this gave you some strategies. Everyone won't work every time, but you have a toolkit of different things that you can do to help you. Are there any questions about nervousness? Anything I might have left out that you want to know about? No? Okay. So let's talk about presenting your information. You have a meeting and you're in charge to present the information. What's the most important part of your presentation? Any thoughts? Introduction? Okay, that is, but there's something even more important. The ending? That's important. There's something even more important. The message? That is important. Something more important than that. So you have the introduction, the ending, the message. What else is important? How well it relates to your audience. Thank you. The most important part of any speech you will ever give in your entire career is the audience. Because you can have the best speech, but if it doesn't resonate to what their needs are, it's not that good. It doesn't matter. So think about your audience. And remember, that's going to help you be less nervous as well, if you're focused on your audience. When you give a speech, the best thing to do is to start with an attention-grabbing device. Now, what do I mean by that? I need to get your attention. So it could be a quote, right? I started this morning talking about a statistic, right? That 4 seconds of making a first impression. If I started by saying, hi, I'm Linda Katz-Wilner, and I'm happy to be here to talk to you today. Same old, right? It's nothing that interesting. But if I start with the statistics, and that's great in your line of work, right? Start with something with numbers. Start with a quote. Start with a question that would make sense to that person and make them want to listen to your talk. Your goal is to get their attention right at the beginning. Because if you start wrong, remember I talked about that impression, it's hard to pull them back in. But if you start with gangbusters and get their attention, you got them. And that's a great way to start. Again, own the room. You're the one speaking. So let me give you an example. If I were introduced as a speaker, or I'm at a meeting and I'm sitting down and somebody said, okay, Linda Wilner's going to talk. Hi, I'm Linda Wilner, and I'd like to talk to you today about communication. What was I doing? I rushed up. I didn't even get myself ready. You own the room. Standing up, now whether you're with a podium or not, standing up and taking a moment to settle yourself will help with your nervousness, and it will help with your image. You're waiting. You deserve the attention of everybody in the room, so I'm not going to talk as I walk up here. By the same token, when I'm done, instead of saying, and thank you, that's it, and I walk away, it's so obvious to everybody I'm in a rush to get off the floor. So own the room when you're speaking. That's so important. Make sure you're organized and succinct. We've already talked about that. When you have your slides, make some transition between slides. I've worked with a lot of people who will then say, oh, fiscal year 2019. And they just read the title. You can read the title. Why am I reading the title to you? Better, I should say, now we're going to discuss the fiscal year of 2019. Right? Make it conversational. Transition from one slide to another so it doesn't sound like this PowerPoint is running the whole presentation. Who's the presentation? It should be me, right? Not the PowerPoint, and we're going to get more into that. Again, summarize at your end of your talk, and don't forget to leave a lasting impression. So these are the things you want to think about every time you have a presentation. And then we come to visual aids. Boy, I remember years ago somebody said to me, well, do you work with PowerPoint? I'm thinking, what's PowerPoint? I mean, this was how many years ago? Maybe 20, I don't know when we started using it. And then all of a sudden, everybody uses PowerPoint or Keynote. And everybody has visuals. And it's way overdone. And the presentation is the slide deck. The presentation isn't me. And for people I work with in a lot of the STEM professions, the science, technology, engineering, math, we have lots of highly dense slides. And we feel that we can't talk without them. So what are we going to do? We have to figure a way to talk, not maybe without them, but to be the one giving the presentation, and this is supplementing it. Because the fact is that if we do slides and have visuals, it increases our retention. So if I talk to you today without any visuals, 3 days later, research says you'll retain about 10%. If I have visuals with it, you'll retain 3 days later 65%. So we know the visuals are important, but it shouldn't be about me reading the slides the whole time. It's good to clarify and support our points, or you need to give numbers. It's important to give numbers. It may even be important to persuade the listeners, but just be careful how you're using it. I wanted to show you how many of you have ever learned or been told the gold standard of how to make a PowerPoint slide? Anybody here? Isn't that amazing? 1, 2 maybe? Maybe 10? But we're often called upon to make our own slides. So how do we make them? Think about the size of the font. We do want people to see it in the back of the room. So just to show you, the ideal font is 16 to 24. I mean, that would be the minimum. If you're putting font up as 12, people can't see it. And I love when I go to a presentation and say, you probably can't see this, but, well, why did I use that slide then? Right? Let me plug in, because I need to use this to demonstrate. Okay. So the size is important. This up at the top actually is, I can't do 2 at once. Let me just open up. Okay, this at the top is 40 font. So look how helpful that is. The style of our text is important. So it's important to use the sans serif, where you don't have the little hooks on all the letters, like Times New Roman. They find that it's easier to read a slide that doesn't have the serifs on it. It's easier to read a book that does. But if you're looking to see how people are going to read slides for readability, make it a simple font when you do so. And no fancy fonts and bells and whistles. It doesn't help. It doesn't help our presentation. Okay, here's the big problem. How much information to put on a slide? We want to avoid clutter. We want to see a lot of white space, which is hard with some of your slides, right? With some of the information you need to relay. I worked with the Army Research Lab for years, and they have a template they have to use for the military. This quad chart that is filled with pictures and data, and it's a nightmare. How can somebody watch those slides? And we're going to go through some strategies for that. So I drive them crazy because I'm constantly critiquing them and saying, you need 5 words on a line. Really? How could you fit just 5 words on a line? But that's what this is, 5 words on a line. Maybe 4 to 6 lines on a visual. Now I'm talking about the gold standard. So I know this doesn't always work, or you have requirements of what you need to show, and it's not going to follow, so we have to then adapt. You should have no more than 1 or 2 slides a minute. So if you're giving a 60-minute presentation, you better not have 300 slides. Hopefully you wouldn't. Better to have maybe 60 slides, because you can't just rush through it. Now, sometimes you want backup slides that you have at the end, so if a question comes up, you can call that up. But you don't want to be overwhelming people with slides. You need to be talking to them. And here's something interesting when I tell people, a lot of them don't realize this. You should avoid reds, blues, greens, and purples. Any thought why? People who are colorblind are not going to be able to see if you're highlighting with that on a slide. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Is this new information to anybody? Okay, so these are some good standards. Again, I know it doesn't always work that way, but think about what you want to achieve. You want to have a lot of that white space. It makes the words stand out more, and it allows me to talk. I shouldn't be, these aren't sentences. That's another thing. Don't put sentences. Just do lists or 1 sentence, which is such a challenge for many of us. When you deliver it, believe me, I've made these mistakes. Don't block the material. That's not going to be helpful. People can't see it. Don't stand there and read the slides. And believe me, when I see scientists, especially, they're standing there, I'm reading the chart, and what happens to this side of the room? You're not even connecting with me. So the goal would be to face the room, maybe have a 45-degree angle, and just look over your shoulder so you can read the slide, or you read a monitor in front of you. You don't need to be reading like this. And if I'm reading like this, or if I have so much text, you're not listening to me. You're reading the slides. And so think about what's more important. Again, face the audience, and don't overuse the pointer. So there are some people, I don't have a red pointer on this, but some people, even with this is a new thing I'll talk about, they're constantly showing you things and going back and forth. And I remember working with a group of people, and one of the older people said, this may be fine for the millennials, but it's driving me crazy. I can't stand all the animation on the slides. There's too much going on. Just give me the information. So you have to think of the style of everybody in the audience when you're doing that. Any questions about the slides? All right, so I want to just show you 2 devices. You see I've been playing around with 2 different devices when I've been talking. I've always used a remote pointer, and it usually has a laser, the red laser on the top. But the interesting thing now, it would work here, but on the newer monitors, you can't use a laser pointer. It doesn't show up. It doesn't read it, so you have no pointer. So there are other types of devices. This one, it's from Logitech, and it's the Spotlight presenter, and I just got it, and the only glitch I'm finding is that my videos are snagging with it, which shouldn't happen. So I have to explore that a little bit more. But the nice feature of this is it has the spotlight. So if you have charts with lots of numbers and you need to explain it to somebody, there are a few things you can do. You can do something like this and say, I'd like you to focus here. And actually, whoops, let me back up. You can actually, it's not happening now, you can magnify You can magnify sections of this. So for your purposes, this could be a great tool to use. I can also activate the video from here, which normally you can't, but once it starts after about 10 seconds, it likes to stop for a second. This is a really nice feature that I think would be really helpful for people who have to deal with the highly dense slides. The other thing you could do is highlight sections of your slides so that you can say the yellow portion of the slide, don't use red or green, but the yellow portion of the slide is what we're talking about first. Or highlight information, or animate without overdoing it information, or present a little bit at a time, where you may present one line and then present the next line so they're not overwhelmed with information, they're not reading ahead of you. The other thing I have, which I've seen recently, and probably wondering what I was doing with my hand, this is another remote. So this is a nice feature too, because I constantly put my remote down and walk away, and where's my remote? And it stays right on my finger. And I can just push the slides, I can darken the slides, I could do a lot with it, but I can't point. It doesn't have a pointer. So there are just different things you can use to, when you're presenting, to make it easier so you're not running back and forth or saying to somebody, next slide, next slide. The slides shouldn't be the focus. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do, I asked Mary Susan if she could provide a few slides for me so that we can look at them. And again, some slides may be great, and some slides may need improvement. Some slides may be, this is what we get, we can't change it, how are we going to manage with it? So I have 3 different slides, and what I'd like to do in some of the remaining time is have you look at the slides as a table and talk about what you think is good about the slide or what you think could be better. Now, just to let you know, maybe in the transfer, some of the things may have moved a little bit in the slides. But take a look at this first slide. And at your table, discuss what you think is good about the slide, and if there are any improvements necessary, what you might do to improve it, and how you would present that slide to a group. So take time at your table just to discuss that, see what you think. Okay, so this slide is not as, we're going to get more complex as we go along. What are some thoughts about this slide? Anybody at this table has something to say about it? Garen. Whoops, let me just, sorry about that. Here you go.
Yeah, I broke it. So we didn't like that 69 was kind of up and down on the slide. We thought that it would be better side to side.
That may have been in the transfer that happened.
And yeah. Yep.
Anything else?
We also didn't like that the coach was in red letters, because that was one example you gave us that wouldn't work well generally. And we also didn't like the choppiness of the different lines, how they kind of move back and forth as you go down the lines. Like some are left aligned, some are middle aligned, and we thought that was overall hard to follow.
Okay. And again, some of it might have been in the transfer to my computer from these slides, but those are some good points. What are some good things you saw about the slide?
Well, I think we liked that it used an image. That was definitely helpful to portray what was going on there. We pretty much just talked about the bad.
It's always easy to criticize, right? We're just terrible. Are there any other comments about that slide? Yes. There you go. And that's Dasha?
Dasha.
Dasha.
We thought if we take out the words teach, support, that line of words, take it out and leave competencies, opportunities, attitudes, career goals, like take out the first words and then maybe say it instead of displaying it well.
Okay, so you're saying, so if you took out the verbs, especially because you're highlighting the COACH, it may stand out more.
Right.
And then actually when you're talking, you can talk about that, but it doesn't have to be all there. Okay. Again, these are all stylistic differences that people might have, but good points. But again, you can see the red may be a problem for somebody. It wouldn't stand out as much if they were colorblind. Any other comments? Okay, well, let's look at the next one. See, with 2 pointers, I have them both out of my hands right now. Okay, let's see what. Okay. I did not mention images, and I think it's very important to have some type of image because, again, it helps the retention of the information and makes it more interesting. And now the style, not necessarily in your world with numbers, but the style is to have less is more. Have a picture and maybe a line. That's not going to help you with numbers. But the less you have on there, the more that information stands out. So that's something to think about. Okay, now we have another slide, which is more complex. So talk about this and see what you like about it and what you think can be improved on that slide. And just take a few moments to do that. Okay. Let's see. Any comments? Well, there are comments. Who wants to share a comment about this slide? Anybody? Okay. Oops. Yanan.
There's too many words, like the definition isn't necessary, and it just clutters up the whole slide.
Okay. And one thing as I look at this slide that I think about is know your purpose of the slide, because sometimes your purpose is to send them home with the notes so they have the information. And so we may tend to put more information for that. It may be more labor intensive, but you might want different handouts if people are taking them home than what you're going to use when you're presenting. So I might take away the top, oh, you see, now it's magnifying it. I might take away the top section and just talk about this when I'm speaking to the group. But if I really want you to have that information, send you home with a PowerPoint deck that has more information. But it's more labor intensive to do that way. Any other comments? Anybody see anything else? Yes? Oh, okay. Inconsistent punctuation. Tell me what you mean there. Here, I'll give you the mic.
Just for the different kind of expectations from the protege. There's like semicolons and then nothing and then period at the end.
Okay. So you need to have that balance, the same punctuation. Yes, great. And again, we can look at our own slides, and every time we look at it, we find something that you don't notice the first time with editing. I just lost track whose hand was.
It's repetitive.
It's for recording.
The word, okay. The word professional is in there 4 times on one slide. And clearly, if you're talking about protege and mentors, it's anything, it's only just a professional environment. So it doesn't need to be said.
Okay. All right. So we're hearing that there's a lot of verbiage that doesn't need to be there, that's redundant. Anything else? Anybody see anything grammatically or? Yeah, okay. What's that?
It says a protege can expect to.
Okay.
And it also says kind of their mentor reflect about what you are looking for. So they're changing the subjects.
The subjects, okay. So we don't have the consistency. Who knows what I mean when I say parallel structure? Okay, just a few. So do you want to explain what parallel structure is? So you had to raise your hand. Do you want to explain that?
The first word of the bullet should have the same word form, so they should all begin with verbs, probably.
And that's a challenge when we have to do that, but it makes, so if everybody didn't hear that, you need to make sure when you have bulleted lists that they all start with the same part of speech. So for example, we have contact, whoops, let me back up. We have oh, this is so large right now, but I'm not going to play with that. We have contact, we have reflect, that's good. All of a sudden, a safe environment, we need a verb. So it could be create a safe environment, right? Take responsibility, provide. So everything there is parallel except one, and it just throws off the rhythm and the flow when your slide is not parallel. And that's so important. Not everybody thinks about it, but it's so important to have organized slides that way. And then as you're talking the slides, it makes it easier to talk about because they follow that same pattern. Did anybody see anything else? Or have any other comments? Nothing else? And another thing, if I were presenting this, I might animate it so one shows up at a time, so it's easier to discuss, and you're not reading ahead and reading the whole slide as I'm trying to talk. Especially if I need to elaborate about each point, I've lost you because you're reading the whole list. Any comments? So then we get to a slide which becomes a big challenge. What do we do here? So skip it. So I'm trying to share this information with somebody, and so I'm using the slides or giving them a handout with this. What are some strategies that you think you can use to help you relay this information when I'm stuck? I can't change this chart, so what can I do? Wait, you need to talk to the slide, you said? Yes. Who's talking? Okay. I thought I heard it there and I saw your hand up. Okay, Brett.
Thank you. You have to talk to the slide and walk someone through how to read that. Because am I going to look at the rows first? Am I looking at the headings first? Your eyes kind of go all over the place. So you really need to talk through it and explain how to read the slide. That's probably the first thing. And then get more and more detailed. You have to start out like a higher level and then keep drilling in. And probably ask people questions along the way and make sure they're still with you.
Okay. And that's also where you might even say at the first column, like with your words, describe where they have to follow their eyes. And you can do it with a pointer. You can do it by highlighting. I mean, I've worked with some people in the science world where they have these charts, and I said, just highlight that column if that's all you're talking about. You may want to show them the breadth of what's there, but you're not talking about those sections. So just highlight the section you're going to talk about, and then maybe through animation, then highlight the next section, so you're walking people through it both verbally, like you had mentioned, but also visually with the slides. Does that make sense? Any other comments? Yeah, okay, you're back there first. Okay, so what they're saying is you can split it into two slides because the top portion isn't relevant to the bottom. Make it easier. It's so taxing for us to look at so much text on a slide.
I was going to say make two slides instead
People
of one.
keep stealing your ideas.
Jeff, you and me both.
Okay. So start thinking about that when you make up your slides. Try to keep some of those guidelines in mind, and sometimes you don't have the choice. Just think of ways that you can verbally or visually make it easier so that when you're speaking, you're not bombarding them with text. All right, so now we talk about questions and answers. Who gets concerned if you have to talk about the questions and answers? I mean, so many people say, the thing I'm most nervous about is the questions and answers after my talk. How do I deal with it? I have some concerns here about problems with speaking, and I'll go into some of them. Are there any other ones that I missed? That if you're you're leading the Q&A, what are some of your concerns? Did I miss anything? Yes.
I would say technology issues.
Okay. That goes, we didn't mention that. You said just say that again.
I said technology issues.
And I left that out this morning, earlier when I was talking about nervousness. That's a big part of nervousness. What if the technology fails? Now, nobody's going to dislike you for it and think you're a bad presenter because you don't have control over it, but it certainly will make you very nervous. I think the biggest thing to have is plan A, B, C, D, E. Always have backup, always have a printout, always have another way, because there is that chance that you can't use your presentation. And if your whole presentation isn't you and it is that deck, you really have a problem now. But that could be a problem in just giving this speech, but also the Q&A. Okay. Any other?
If someone shows that you're wrong.
If somebody shows that you're wrong.
You gave an example of something, but it's wrong. Someone then points it out later.
Okay, what do you do when that points it out in front of the whole group? Yeah. Okay, so I made a statement, and somebody raises their hand and said, what you said, those statistics, that's not right. So what do you do in that situation? What's that?
Drop mic and roll.
Drop mic and roll. What can you do? Let's talk about it offline. Okay. Which is a similar thing you might do with a hostile person, right? And we mentioned that earlier when somebody says something and is hostile. I'll have to get back to you and let me confirm it, and we'll talk after the conference about this, right? So maybe I did make a mistake, but I don't have to say I'm sorry if I still think I'm right. So it's like, let's discuss that. I'm going to look that up because I thought it was something else. So we'll discuss that afterwards and take it out of the conference because there's no reason to keep talking that way. Any other concerns with your Q&A? Okay, so what do you do if I'm finished with my talk and I say, are there any questions? And I left 20 minutes, or I was told to leave, let's say, 30 minutes for questions. And I say, are there any questions? And the room is silent. What would I do as a speaker? Besides leave and say, let's go to happy hour a half hour early, right? Okay, so what would I do? Eric?
You could put yourself in the audience shoes and come up with questions that they might be asking or too afraid to ask. So common questions that you come across.
Absolutely. Have some questions ready. Like if nobody says something, I could say, well, a common question most people ask me is, and that gets the ball rolling. Another thing with different cultures, you have to be sensitive to the fact that some cultures, I'm thinking specifically somebody from China, they're not always going to speak up with a question unless you invite them to ask a question. And in that culture, and if any of you are interested in culture, there's a wonderful book called The Culture Gap, which helps you in the workplace understand different cultures. This woman from France, who's an American who works in France, was telling the story that she was speaking in front of an audience, I think it was in China or Japan, and she said, are there any questions? And nobody answered. She was done. And the person said, let me go up there. And he said, he could read. He could read between the lines, because different cultures can do that, especially Asian cultures. And he could tell by just some of the body language that maybe, Alex, is there anything that you would like to ask about this? And he was able to get it, that he knew that Alex had a question, but Alex isn't going to volunteer, because in that culture, you don't volunteer, you need to be invited to ask a question. And that was mind-blowing to her. She said she could have left the conference and missed all the questions, because once one person started talking, and then she started inviting, like, Craig, are there any questions about anything I said? All of a sudden, Craig started speaking. So you can have some questions prepared. You can also try to read the audience. And again, some of you would not be happy if I put you on the spot and did that. But are there any questions, or is there anything we talked about? And invite people, make it easier for them to ask that question. But it's a very big cultural difference in other cultures. She tells a story, there was a time where she wanted this Chinese person to help her in this meeting because she was training a couple about Chinese culture. And he had pages and pages of notes. And she gets to the meeting, and she's talking, and she's waiting for him to pipe in. And she's talking, and it's a whole day training, and he never pipes in. And at the end of the day, she said, "What happened? I thought you were preparing to help me." And he said, "You never asked me." And so he wasn't going to jump in on his own. So the same way people won't ask questions on their own, you want to observe, listen, to engage and pick up what's going on in the room and see maybe there are questions, but nobody's comfortable asking them. So that's the one thing. So prepare some questions. That was a great point. What if you don't know the answer to the question? What's that? Yeah, let me get back to you. There's nothing wrong with not knowing the answer. I could say, let me get back to you, or I could say, that's not my area of expertise, but John here is on that team. Maybe he has some suggestions that could help without calling somebody out thinking he wouldn't know. But there's nothing wrong. You can't be the expert in everything. And maybe you know somebody else is more prepared to answer that. Now, I'm sure you've been to a meeting and somebody talks, and it's way off topic. What do you do with that? Any thoughts? Yes?
Maybe say you really wanted to focus on like this one topic. I can talk to you privately.
Right, like that's a great question, but we have limited time, and that's not related to the exact topic, but let's meet up afterwards and we'll talk about it. And then you just move on. Okay, excellent, yes.
I would say, okay, it's time for happy hour.
If they can't stay on topic, they're done, right? Okay, we already talked about the hostile. And what about the one person who dominates? I'm sure you've been at a meeting, and this person is up there to show everybody how much he or she knows, and keeps answering the question, asking the questions, and everybody else is like, oh my goodness. What do you do with that person as the speaker? Any thoughts? It's a tough one. Anybody have any ideas? So I guess we'll all have them. Lori, were you going to say something?
Thank you. It seems like you have a lot of interest in this topic. Let's discuss it, at happy hour.
Right. Okay, so thank you. It sounds like you have a lot of interest. Let's discuss it at happy hour or later or another time. An important thing you can also do, it's similar to like a heckler in the audience. If Lori keeps asking me questions, and it's like, enough, Lori, other people have questions. After I say that to you, look away, walk away. Because if I stay there with you, I'm still engaging, and you're going to continue to want to ask questions. But Lori, those are great questions, but I want to we have a limited time. I'd like to hear from somebody else, and then just move away. So you don't want to pay so much attention. The thing you want to be careful about, I mentioned earlier, is don't have a battle with anybody in the audience, because you run the risk of everybody else thinking like, boy, is she snappy to that person, and now I lost my audience. Okay. Here's one of the most important things about Q&A. A lot of times people do the question and answer, and then they say, okay, thank you. Or this is the last question, thank you. And so when you leave, what do you remember? Like if I stopped right now, you're remembering Lori, right? Because Lori asked the last question. And if I say, okay, thank you. Lori had the last word. You never want that as a speaker. You want to have the last word and to recap or have your takeaway message or the persuasive message of whatever you want. You want to have the last word. So finish with the last question, but don't say thank you. Say, what I do want you to remember is we talked about this today, and this is what I want you to, this is what I recommend. Always make sure you speak at the end, because that's setting the theme for who's in charge. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the different things we talked about in these 180 minutes, 3 hours. We talked about aligning the 3 V's of communication: Hopefully you now understand, and some of you have come up to me and said you're aware, and each of you know what your issues may be. There's the visual, the vocal, and the verbal. And hopefully you see them differently now. Because when I talk to people about it, and all of a sudden they say, oh, that's a really interesting way to start to look at the communication. Some people have trouble with the visual part. Some people have trouble with how they sound, and some people have that nailed, but they can't get to the point. So it helps you understand that. You have strategies for speaking succinctly and using the ties, the topic, the introduction, the examples, and the summary. I gave you some suggestions for using to consider in email communication. Notice aligning, speaking, considering. I had to put considering in there to put a verb. And then this afternoon, after the break, we talked about the OLE approach to communication, the observe, the listen, and the engage, how to deliver your presentations, how to control your nervousness, how to interact with your visuals, and handling questions and answers. That's a lot of content that we did in one day. And hopefully it's not overwhelming you, but it's giving you lots of ideas on what you know now or how to explore this further. I'm going to ask you for questions, but what I also want to do is in the back of your books, I gave you an evaluation form. I know that you'll be getting an evaluation form after this, but I'd like you to fill this out. This is more for me to help me know what works, what didn't work, what you think could be better, or just to get your feedback because I find that helpful. If you choose to put your name and agree to let me use those recommendations, I also appreciate that. What I do want to talk about before I open it up to any questions, if there are questions, is some of the resources, because some people came up to me and said, well, what do you have, and how can we now practice some of these things? On my website, on successfully-speaking.com, I have several different options. There is something that you can purchase, actually, which is a 9-module program where you can go through 9 different lessons with videos and articles on different skills for mastering your professional presence. There's also a free library on my website if you look up resources and video library, and there are videos on many of the skills we talked about. How to pause, uptalk, eye contact, handshakes, interview skills, a lot, telephone communication, a lot of different areas. Also, if people do speak English as a second language, we have video lessons for people to help modify their accent. I do a monthly newsletter. Feel free, you can let me know in that to sign up, or you could sign up on the website, where I send out lots of tips about communication. And I do monthly master classes in public speaking. And again, what I mentioned with that is 8 people together where we practice some of these skills. We video, which I know a lot of you love doing, having a video, but looking to see how you're coming across. And a lot of times we're better than we think, and it helps us identify how we can improve. So we do all of those different things. I also wanted to, in the raffle, select somebody, and if you don't want to do it, you can give it to somebody who does, but somebody to attend one of the monthly master classes, which is a 2-hour class that I conduct. So I'm going to have Mary Susan pick somebody from that. Oh, you want me to pick?
Yep.
Okay. All these cards look the same.
That's right. I see an each.
Okay, so let's see. So we have, is L. Duke Allen? Okay, so we'll talk about that afterwards. All right. Are there any specific questions? I know we covered a lot of questions as we talked through today. Are there any questions that you want to ask now? Or feel free, certainly. I'm going to stay around for the happy hour if you have questions. I'd love to hear your questions or what resonated with you, what's helped you, or anything like that. So are there any questions at this point? And I don't have to say a common question is, because I think I've been doing that for the past 3 hours. So, well, if there are no more questions, it's been a pleasure working with all of you. I'm sure you're walking away with some ideas, and what I could recommend is take some little nuggets of what I said. See what things were more challenging for you, so you can see if you can start to make that change and improvement in your own communication skills. And if you have any questions, even after today, feel free to email me or contact me. Thank you.